1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the big three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we see how in May, victory was celebrated, while behind the scenes, political tension was mounting between the Allies. By July, a new world order emerges, dominated by two, not three, superpowers. And we'll see how veiled threats and broken promises in the summer of 1945 shaped the political future of Europe for the next 50 years. At the beginning of 1945, the three great Allied powers, the Soviet Union, America, and Britain, were engaged in the last stages of the war in Europe, even though the war in the Pacific was far from over. During February and March, the Soviet Union took Central and Eastern Europe, and the British and the Americans took the North, South, and West. By early April, Hitler was holed up in his bunker in Berlin, but he ordered his armies to fight on, even though defeat was inevitable. The Allies discovered concentration camps in Poland and Germany, further proof, if any were needed, of the full horror of the Nazi regime. On the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. That evening, the Soviet Union took Berlin, and victory in Europe was imminent. But for America, any sense of relief or expectation was overshadowed by events at home. Earlier in the month, President Roosevelt, who had led America for 3 consecutive terms, suddenly died. He was buried on April the 15th. Leela Arida was living in Brooklyn at the time.
We heard the news over the radio. Everyone was in the street telling friends and neighbors and hanging out of the windows saying, "Did you hear?" I went to tell my friend who lived next door, and then I told my aunt, who began to cry. On the day of his funeral, people lined the streets all the way from Georgia, some 1,000 miles. Roosevelt was like a father figure to us all.
The death of Roosevelt came as a profound shock, not only to the United States, but also to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union.
For the British forces, the American forces, it was a blow, because Roosevelt had become the symbol of the American fighting power, and a symbol which he had rather carefully nurtured.
The United Kingdom, of course, felt that it lost an ally who understood it and with whom it didn't always agree, but nevertheless was convinced of his goodwill. Now, in the United States, of course, it was a traumatic, transforming experience. Not least because a wholly unknown man became president.
It is with a heavy heart.
This man was Harry Truman, who was virtually unknown on the international diplomatic scene.
Poor old Harry Truman stepping into FDR's shoes. The shadow of FDR fell over Truman's presidency in a way that Truman himself was acutely aware of. There was a scrum of reporters outside, and Truman said, "Nice to see you, boys." He knew all the Capitol Hill reporters. And he said, "I don't know if you fellas have ever had a load of hay fall on you, but yesterday when I heard the news, the moon, the planets, and all the stars fell on me." And it was an amazing kind of revelation of the way he really thought. He was terrified, I think, and completely aware of his own lack of preparedness for the role that had been thrust upon him. Truman was a farm boy from Missouri. He'd had no education beyond high school. He was a plain-spoken, ordinary man who made much of his ordinariness. Even in the short time that he'd been vice president, Roosevelt hadn't taken him into his confidence. Roosevelt hadn't told him about any plans he might have for how to deal with Stalin and Churchill. So he was on a very, very fast learning curve when he came into office.
That America will continue the fight for freedom.
In his first public speech, Truman promised to continue America's war effort, demanding nothing less than unconditional surrender from Germany and Japan.
Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
In Europe, at least, surrender was not far away. On the first day of May, the Red Army under General Zhukov took Berlin. The Allies were now in control of Europe, but still faced resistance.
All the German soldiers had given up fighting. On our way into the marketplace, we ran into senior German officers taking off insignia that would identify them. They asked if the British had arrived. Finally, we saw the town's civilian authorities surrender the key to the British. I was expecting the British to look like the British devils of the propaganda portrayals, but instead they looked just like us.
The Second World War in Europe did not end cold one day with suddenly all the guns falling silent. It sort of trickled and faltered to a stop, like an old-fashioned gramophone running down.
The Germans were terrified by the Red Army advance because it was known that the Germans had behaved appallingly in the east, even worse than they had in the west. And they knew that they would be shown no mercy by the Red Army troops who'd lost relatives in the fighting on the Eastern Front.
A lot of German soldiers, and especially the SS people, felt that there was nothing to gain from giving up. They might just as well fight on. And I've met Red soldiers who told me about being in battles well into May, second, third week of May 45, where they just encountered groups of Germans who were still shooting, because what was the point of being taken prisoner if you thought you were going to die? In those last days of the Third Reich, hysteria and despair prevailed. Generals killed themselves in their hundreds. Officials kill themselves in their thousands, and ordinary civilians in their tens and hundreds of thousands.
Hitler himself, Goebbels, his wife and their children killed themselves. Himmler committed suicide when he was captured. Goering later on, after he'd stood trial and was faced with execution by hanging, which he thought was unmilitary. There's a letter written by Goebbels' wife, Magda Goebbels, just before she and her husband killed their 6 children and then killed themselves in the bunker right at the end of the war, where she says, I'm going to do my children a service because life will be completely pointless, will not be worth living without National Socialism, so we're all going to die.
With no hope left, finally, on the 2nd of May, the Germans sent envoys to meet Montgomery to agree terms for peace. 2 days later came unconditional surrender. But at the very moment of victory, the Allies were arguing among themselves, in a foretaste of far greater trouble to come.
Keitel from Hitler's headquarters signed a surrender document at Eisenhower's headquarters at Reims on May the 7th. But then the Soviets were enraged that they hadn't had senior people at it and insisted the whole thing was redone a day later in Berlin with their proper delegation and commissars present. And you pays your money and takes your choice, which could be considered the real German surrender.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. The German war is therefore at an end.
People greeted the news with a mixture of joy and relief that the nightmare was finally over.
At the end of the war, my mother showed my sister and me a packet of cyanide she had got from the family pharmacy in Zagreb and was determined to administer to us should the Nazis have invaded England. She was not going to have others decide where and when we should die. I asked whether she would now destroy it. She said no, and having shown us the packet of white powder, returned it to the rear of the shelf in Father's wardrobe.
In Moscow, the Soviet Union celebrated the extraordinary success of Stalin's Red Army and the Soviet people.
The Soviet Union had enormous reason to feel incredibly proud of itself. It had not only liberated all of the territory of the Soviet Union as it had been before 1941, it had also moved into Eastern and indeed deep into Central Europe and was across more than half of Germany. It had captured the German capital. It was the strongest land power in the world. It was one of the 3 strongest air powers.
Stalin was determined to celebrate properly the victory in the war with a great military parade across Red Square. So there he was, standing on the top of the mausoleum, Zhukov coming across Red Square on the white Arab stallion, announcing to Stalin that victory had been achieved, and then the parade of all the regiments with their spoils, the banners of the Wehrmacht, which they threw at his feet to signal that Germany had been unconditionally defeated by the might of the Red Army.
In London and across Europe, Britons also celebrated.
As the hour of 3 p.m. drew near for Churchill's speech, groups of people, both indoors and out, gathered around any available wireless set. Suddenly everyone became quiet.
Today is Victory in Europe Day.
And I remember looking around and catching the eyes of 1 or 2 people, and it seemed as if the same expression of thankfulness and pleasure could be read in each.
What happened on V-Day was really basically everybody took the day off. It was a public holiday for most people. You know, they dressed up. There was a tremendous desire to come to London, to be in the capital, to be where it was at, to sort of throng down the Mall, to celebrate outside Buckingham Palace. And bunting in the street and flags and, you know, drinking and dancing and doing the conga. Some interesting stories about older evacuees who were determined to get on a train and make sure that they were in London for the celebration.
But for Churchill, victory was just a brief reprieve from new anxieties. Stalin now occupied vast swathes of Eastern Europe, and there was no indication that he planned to leave.
At VE Day on the 8th of May, when everybody was celebrating and he appeared before the crowds in Whitehall, he made his great speeches, London, the great hippopotamus, the great rhinoceros, which had survived all these bombardments. His Prime Minister's box was filling up with all the problems relating to the Soviets in Yugoslavia, in Poland. It cast a very grave shadow over his celebration of the victory.
Victory signalled the beginning of a new battle between the superpowers for ultimate control of Europe. Peace would be almost as traumatic as the war itself. On the 8th of May, the Nazis had surrendered to the Allies. But this also marked the moment when the Allied wartime coalition began to crumble. Europe was now divided between the Red Army in the east and the American and British armies in the west. Behind these lines, the countries liberated from the Nazis were now controlled by new occupying forces who would determine their fate.
There was a great degree of disagreement between the so-called Big Three, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States of America as to the future of those states that had been under German occupation in Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union was adamant that these states were either liberated or going to be liberated by the Red Army, and so they would have to have a great degree of say as to the future governments and political systems in these countries.
The Soviet Union was determined that they have a cordon sanitaire, that there be buffer states between it and the Western powers. The United Kingdom worried about this because for centuries, for 1,000 years, the main foreign policy of the United Kingdom is not to have a single great power on the European continent. And here was the fear that, in fact, Germany had tried through 2 world wars, she'd been defeated, and here comes the Soviet Union, essentially a continent itself, now threatening to be this dominant power.
In Great Britain, and especially Winston Churchill, there was a feeling that democracy had to be the trademark. Democracy had to be the mainstay of all these political systems. So there was a great degree of aggravation about the prospect of numbers of Eastern European countries being dominated by the Soviet Union.
The principle of democracy for all had been established at a peace conference in Yalta in February. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt had agreed that all nations previously under German control would have democratic governments and free elections. But by mid-May, it became clear that for many countries in Eastern Europe, this was not going to happen. As the Soviet Union replaced the Germans, they brought their own political system, imposed through Stalin's secret police, the NKVD.
With the Red Army came the NKVD, came Soviet governmental officials, came party representatives, and Stalin made sure that Soviet control was tight in all of the countries of Eastern Europe. Stalin wanted to anesthetize any possible threat from anti-communist groups in the countries that the Red Army had liberated from Nazism. The police forces sent in by Stalin from the USSR rounded up known Nazi sympathizers, rounded up members of the middle and upper classes, moved in on all of the elites who were judged to be hostile to communism, so that the prisons started bulging.
Everything that had been constructed at Yalta, which was based on why Britain had gone to war and why Britain and America had defeated Nazism, was to produce a better world. And here we are, there's victory, there's still celebration going on in the streets, and Churchill knows that everything is going sour. That behind this Iron Curtain, things are going on, which I think Churchill uses the phrase, this isn't the war, this isn't the world we fought for.
What the Americans thought of Churchill was that he was being over-concerned. He didn't really understand that the new world was going to be different. And so the tensions between the British and the Americans were there because they had different views of the threat of the Soviet Union and different views of what might happen to Europe.
Britain had gone to war over Poland, so Churchill was particularly concerned for its future. Stalin had agreed to hold free elections there, but had now installed his own government and arrested the main opposition leaders.
I had fought in the Polish resistance in Warsaw until it fell to the Germans and we were sent to Auschwitz. When the Americans finally freed us, the big question was, do we go back to Poland? Already we had got word that it was starting all over again, that the Russians had sent resistance fighters to Siberia. One day I received a letter from my mother saying, "Don't come back." So we decided to join the Polish army in Italy.
Poland was absolutely crucial to the buffer zone that Stalin wanted to create in Eastern Europe, because so much trouble had come to Russia from Poland in centuries past, and indeed in the 20th century. So it was crucial for Stalin to assert that the Soviet Union had a special interest in having a comfortable relationship with the new Polish government, and that basically meant a government in Poland of which Stalin himself personally approved.
The war ended on the 8th of May, and Churchill was astonished 4 days later, on the 12th of May, to learn that the Americans were already planning to withdraw and about to withdraw troops from Europe. But the withdrawal of these troops really sent a signal to Stalin that the United States was not going to be in a position to insist on the fulfillment of any of the Soviet pledges, and it came just as the fate of the Polish negotiators, who were meant to be the future leaders of an independent Polish government, was announced. They'd been seized by the Soviets outside Warsaw, taken to Moscow, put in the Lubyanka prison, and had been charged and found guilty of all sorts of spurious Soviet charges. But these were the people who Stalin had agreed at Yalta were to be an integral part of a new, broad-based, all-party Polish government.
It's a terrible moment that for Churchill, the sense that after everything Britain had endured, Poland had fallen into the Soviet maw in unspeakable misery, and Britain, which had gone into the war still as one of the richer and greatest nations on earth, had fallen from the first rank of powers.
But while on the international scene the Soviet Union was displacing Britain, for the people of both countries, day-to-day life in peacetime was as harsh as it had been in war. The Soviet Union was a country in ruins. Devastated by the enormous effort it took to win the war.
The cost of the war for the Soviet Union and its impact is unimaginable. The best estimate is that a total of 27 million people died as a more or less direct result of hostilities, including about 8 million actual battle dead. And one of the most striking images, which is recorded in Soviet writers of the time, is gangs of orphan children roaming the streets, begging because all the adults had been killed.
Stalin was a very worried man at the very moment of victory over Germany, because he knew what a dreadful condition the USSR was in. The destroyed economy, the ruined administration, the huge responsibilities of reconstruction.
Stalin knew he was going to have to use brute force to get his people to rebuild their country. His troops had seen, even in the depredations of war, a better life in the West, and were returning home full of hope and expectation, but to face nothing.
They had seen a much more orderly society. They had seen shops and churches open. They had seen a standard of living in some of these countries that they had previously thought unimaginable in the world. Stalin was going to arrest anyone who called for a relaxation of the regime among the civilian population, and he was going to astound Soviet people with his ingratitude for what they had done for him and his regime in the war. He was going to clamp down as never before.
Stalin began to round up returning soldiers suspected of being potential dissidents or anyone else who might be an anti-communist. In public, relations between the big three looked cordial, but behind the scenes, a diplomatic war was raging. Churchill was losing his fight against a Europe dominated by the Soviet Union. The fallout would have a devastating impact for decades to come. By June 1945, Europe was under Allied occupation. In Poland and much of the East, Stalin's secret police were purging anti-communist factions. This was an open violation of the Allies' agreement for a free and democratic Europe. But there were other diplomatic wrangles to resolve. The future of Germany had long been the source of vehement disagreement.
There were various plans throughout 1944 and early 1945 as to what would happen to Germany at the end of the war.
There was an idea in 1944, the Morgenthau Plan, that Germany essentially be reduced to a sheep pasture. Pastoralization of Germany, it was called.
The Allies couldn't really agree. They just couldn't agree. Stalin wanted a neutral Germany. The Western powers, of course, did not want to see a neutralized Germany completely, but nonetheless, they didn't want to see a resurgent Germany.
And if you're not going to reduce it to nothingness, how are you going to control it? And who gets to control it? And so it's decided that it's going to be broken up into zones, so each of the Allies, plus France, have their own zone.
On the 3rd of July, the Allied forces moved into their assigned zones.
The French got a very small part of Germany, and basically in the southwest, the part that was closest to France itself. The Americans took over south and much of central Germany. The British occupied the north, with the exception of Bremen, because the Americans wanted a seaport leading into the North Sea. And then the Russians, the Soviet Union, took over the east, which later, of course, became the German Democratic Republic, and the line drawn more or less vertically down some way across the middle of Germany. And then Berlin was itself divided, again, into 4 sectors.
The occupying Allied forces faced an immediate problem. There were millions of displaced people on the move across Europe, many of them trying to find their way home or to a place of refuge.
I had been taken away by the Nazis to Austria as a slave. After the war, I wanted to get home. I asked a Russian officer for help, but we were only taken as far as Hungary. Then I discovered we were going to be sent to Japan to fight for Stalin. That was it. I was never going to fight for Stalin, and started looking for a fellow deserter. It felt like months to walk back to Austria, our desired destination, where there were about 500,000 political refugees like me, with nowhere to go. Here I found a British Catering Corps transit camp. At my first breakfast, they asked me what I'd like. I could have anything, eggs or whatever, but I wanted bread. It was the first time I tasted bread since my mother had made me some in 1942.
The Nazis had drafted in well over 7 million forced labourers to help with the war industries and many other things. So you had, in addition to the German population, the slave labourers who were trying to get home, displaced persons. Slave labourers often became reclassified as displaced persons, and then German refugees from the east, all milling around, mostly in the Allied sectors, though not exclusively so, creating further problems of supply and keeping things going.
Amongst the millions of displaced people were Jewish survivors, for whom the horrors of the Holocaust redoubled their desire for their own homeland.
A few 100,000 Jews had survived in Europe during the war. Most of those Jews were living in what had been the concentration camps. Of course, they were no longer prisoners. They could walk out, but they had nowhere to go. They were generally housed in the barracks of their former guards. Most of them remained there, hoping that they could qualify for emigration, and many of them demanded admission to Palestine.
They would join thousands of Jewish people who had officially emigrated to Palestine before the war.
We were very glad the war was over, but there was also the shadow of finding out who had lived and who had died back in Europe. My mother never knew where her own mother had disappeared. We found out later she had died on a train on her way to a death camp. The big thing in my life was the secret Zionist army, the Haganah. Everyone I knew was in it, but it was very hush-hush. My main job was to guard Haifa's Jewish quarter against Arab attacks. I also did nursing at a British camp where European Jews who had arrived here illegally were being detained. It was good for them to be able to talk to someone who was already living here in what one day would be Israel.
In 1945, Palestine was under British control as part of its empire in the Middle East.
During World War I, the British had made promises to everybody. They'd promised the Jews in the Balfour Declaration of 1917 that they would facilitate the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, with certain provisos. They had promised the Arab nationalists the creation of a great Arab state. The British found themselves saddled with responsibility for what was called by many people a twice-promised land. And it was argued by both sides that promises had been made and promises had been betrayed. In Palestine itself, about 30% of the population at this time was Jewish and about 70% was Arab. The Zionists hoped to create a majority in Palestine by bringing about a large wave of immigration, both of displaced persons and of other Jews who had survived in Europe. But the Arab nationalists, of course, were dead set against the idea that they should be turned into a minority in their own country. And so they strongly resisted the idea that there should be any immigration whatsoever. When the war ended, the pent-up frustrations, both among the Zionists and among the Arab nationalists in Palestine, boiled over.
This frustration led Zionist militants to escalate their attacks against British troops. In 1947, the British decided to pull out and handed over responsibility for Palestine to the newly established United Nations.
I have been instructed by His Majesty's government that they have consequently decided they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
In 1948, Palestine was forcibly partitioned, with the larger part of the country becoming the new state of Israel, still a source of grievance and conflict today. This is just one legacy of the great political upheaval which took place in the immediate aftermath of the war.
The pattern in southeastern Europe was not much different from the pattern in other parts of Europe, when in a sort of political vacuum, rival organizations were at each other's throats to try and achieve some kind of political supremacy. In Yugoslavia, the situation was less favorable for the Soviet Union because here you had a nationalist, communist resistance organization which had grown into a massive political force. And by the end of the war, with the retreat of the German occupying forces, this was the force that really captured and created the state of Yugoslavia, but it was not necessarily a force which was simply going to be subservient to the Soviet Union.
In the Baltic states, there was guerrilla resistance to the Soviet reoccupation, which continued throughout the late 40s and 50s. In the Ukraine also, there was a great deal of partisan resistance to the Soviet reoccupation. They were not welcomed as liberators by any means in the Western Soviet Union. And the NKVD, the Interior Ministry forces, waged a long and hard campaign against partisans in these areas long after the fighting finished.
In southern and eastern Europe, dramatic regime changes were underway. People found themselves living under yet another repressive regime, sowing the seeds of conflict that would resurface decades later. The issue of who would control Europe would have to be resolved between the big three. After the break, we'll see how President Truman was to dramatically change the relationship between America and its wartime allies. By July 1945, a defeated Germany was divided into Allied zones of occupation. The east of Europe was under the control of the Soviet Union, and the west under the British and Americans. There were signs of political struggle and unrest throughout Europe. The dominance of the Soviet Union worried Churchill, but he also had pressing matters to deal with back home. In July, the wartime coalition government under his leadership was dissolved. Britain returned to party politics. For the first time in 10 years, there was to be a general election.
I think the main thing about the mood of the country at that time was a desire for change such as had not existed since 1918. People felt very strongly that they hadn't gone out and fought and died in order to go back to the same unfair society that they'd known in the 30s, that they wanted something new and better and freer and fresher and fairer.
An awful lot of the British people felt that they'd had enough of government by perceived toffs. They felt the toffs had got them into this mess, and they'd had enough of it all, and they were set upon a more equal and just society, which was going to be run by people who did not look and sound like the people who got them into the frightful mess in 1939.
There was a desire, a quite complex feeling about what was wanted from this post-war world. And in a sense, there was very much the feeling that there had got to be a better Britain. On the one hand, you had a desire for a return to normality. On the other hand, that normality somehow had to be better.
Labour fought the 1945 election essentially on the basis of the Beveridge Report, which had advocated a system of national insurance, a system of ensuring that everybody was educated, that nobody starved in the streets, that there was a safety net beyond which nobody was to be allowed to fall.
The election was held on the 5th of July 1945. Over 70% of the population voted, including British servicemen and women all over the world. But it would take 3 weeks to collect and count their ballots. Churchill and Attlee would have to wait to find out who would lead post-war Britain. But international politics continued regardless. In mid-July, the Big Three were to meet at Potsdam in Germany to decide the future of Europe.
Churchill, as a precaution, took Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, to Potsdam with him, just in case the worst happened and Labour won the election.
This was the first time all three Allied leaders had been on German soil since the war began, and Churchill and Truman took the opportunity to tour Berlin before the Potsdam meeting.
Churchill had seen, on a fairly regular basis, film taken by RAF planes of the bombing of German cities, but that was taken from 8,000 feet or 10,000 feet. But like everybody, he hadn't seen it from the ground. Suddenly to come to this city, and in fact go round with Truman, they travelled around together, neither man had seen it, and he was very shocked, both by the devastation and also by the refugees. He was astounded by the desperate situation of the Berliners who had nothing.
The Berliners could be seen scurrying amongst the rubble with their pathetic bundles. They looked and acted like rats by disappearing into the man-made holes leading to basements of large department stores. A few I saw who came out of hiding were pasty-looking, emaciated, and looked so very much older than they were. These people Hitler had declared were the master race. If only they knew what their destiny held for them.
On the agenda for discussion were the future of Germany, including the amount of war reparations they would pay, and the future of Poland and liberated Europe. Each of the Allied leaders wanted a very different result, so negotiations were tense.
Potsdam itself, as a conference, was not a peace conference which included, for example, representatives of the defeated German nation or the defeated Italian nation. It really was a conference between the Big Three again, the USA, the USSR, and Great Britain, to try and thrash out their relationship in the future.
Churchill went to Potsdam with two separate objectives. One was to have one last attempt to persuade Stalin to restore, because they'd now been subverted, restore freedoms to Poland, the country for which Britain had gone to war. But as he had never met Truman before, his second objective was to really have a conference similar to the ones he used to have with Roosevelt to settle the outstanding issues in Anglo-American relationships.
Truman, as far as one can tell, had a slightly suspicious view of the United Kingdom, which indeed was common with much of his part of the country, which is more or less the middle South, one might say, the northern part of the South, which didn't have any basic links with the United Kingdom and saw Great Britain as a competitor rather than a natural hands-across-the-sea ally.
The Americans' primary objective was to assert their power over the Soviet Union.
Now, when Truman became president, he'd had no preparation, particularly in foreign policy. And of course, he turned to Roosevelt's advisors. And they decided with the new president, this was the opportunity to bring, as it were, some realism into foreign policy making. These advisors came up with the idea of quid pro quo. That is to say that if Stalin wanted something, he had to give something, because they had the perception that the United States was surrendering points or territory to Stalin and not receiving anything in return.
Stalin at Potsdam wanted Soviet interests to be protected in Eastern Europe. He wanted Poland to be moved westwards and the USSR to take up the space vacated. He wanted reparations from the Germans in payment for the damage that they'd done in the USSR, and he wanted the Western Allies to confirm all of this.
Truman felt he could take a tough line with Stalin because he had a new secret weapon. On July the 16th, the atom bomb had been successfully tested in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Truman believed the bomb would help both to defeat Japan and to assert control over the Soviet Union.
Truman very clearly assumed that the possession of the bomb would be an incredible ace in the hole for him, that if worse came to worse, he could actually announce this, and the Soviets would strike back in awe and wonder, in shock and awe, one might say, at the weapon the United States now possessed.
And when Truman said cunningly to Stalin that he had a little secret he wanted to share with Stalin, a little secret that might astound Stalin, Stalin, of course, knew what the secret was already from his intelligence agents. He knew that he couldn't trust the United Kingdom or the USA because he had an understanding that this is how great powers operated against each other. He thought that economic rivalries would produce political and military tensions in the post-war world. And he thought that eventually there would be a Third World War.
Of course, what Truman didn't know was that Stalin already knew the United States had the bomb. And therefore, it didn't come as such a profound surprise. What the bomb did for Truman was give him massive self-confidence in this debut on the world stage. The Americans had the profound, the overwhelming weapon, and the Soviets didn't.
This was the dawn of the atomic age. Possession of the bomb was to dominate world politics for the next 60 years. In July, Stalin was already secretly developing his own bomb. But until it was ready, he had little leverage on issues like reparations. All he could do was remind the Allies of the great sacrifice the Soviet people had made to win the war. But Truman saw no value in a Germany weakened further by excessive reparations and demanded a reduction in the Soviet Union's share. In return, Stalin insisted on a newly expanded Poland, governed by leaders under his control. The two great powers struck a deal, and Churchill, who had fought for Poland's freedom, won little but an empty promise of free elections. Mid-conference, Churchill and Attlee went home for the results of their election.
It's a curious situation that a British general election took place after the defeat of Germany, but whilst the Allies were still fighting against Japan. What was even more curious, probably to both Stalin and Truman by that time, was that Churchill was defeated.
Even Clement Attlee himself thought the best result he could hope for would be a hung parliament, and in the end he got a huge majority.
The Labour Party's great victory shows that the country is ready for a new policy to face new world conditions.
It was inconceivable to the Soviets, of course, who pointed out they would have made certain that the outcome of the election would have been as they wished. I don't think that Truman and the Americans took quite this same approach, but everyone was stunned, I think, when Churchill was defeated.
The story is that somebody rang Churchill and said, well, it could be a blessing in disguise, and Churchill said, well, very well disguised.
His public response was this was very fair, the people had it very hard, it wasn't surprising they wanted to change. I think personally he obviously felt very, I think bitter is probably too strong a word, but he obviously felt very disappointed. He felt that he had run the race and then he'd been, as it were, rejected at the winning post.
Clement Attlee, Britain's new Prime Minister, returned to the Potsdam Conference alone to discover that Britain had little influence over the proceedings.
Attlee just slotted naturally into this in Churchill's place and did more or less the same things that Churchill would have done.
So it wasn't a question of Attlee abandoning Churchill's strong positions. He maintained them, but failed in all of them because Stalin and Truman wouldn't defer to the British point of view.
Although, of course, it was politely known as the Big Three, Attlee, Truman and Stalin. Actually, it was really the Big 2 1/4, wasn't it? And it was at Potsdam they started to realise it. Britain was not a great voice in the world any longer. The world was already beginning to be dominated by two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States.
Potsdam left many issues about the political future of Europe unresolved. But it was clear that this was the beginning of the end of any cooperation between the Allies. Within 3 months of the end of the war in Europe, a new war had started. The Cold War. A struggle between the two newly established superpowers with very different ideologies, but a shared ambition of world domination.